Japan told its own people it had sunk 11 American aircraft carriers and 2 battleships in a single battle off Formosa. Church bells rang in the home islands. The emperor sent his congratulations to the fleet. The number of American ships on the bottom of the ocean was 0. The ships Tokyo had buried on the radio were not gone. They were under tow, low in the water and trailing oil, crawling west at 5 knots toward a stretch of the Pacific that appeared on no civilian map. Waiting there was a thing no navy in history had built before, a shipyard with no land under it, hauled out to the middle of the ocean in pieces and bolted together on the open water, with cranes tall enough to lift a wrecked capital ship into the air and set it back down, repaired. That is the part of the war almost nobody tells. The fighting gets the films. The thing that let the United States stay in the Western Pacific for a year at a stretch and keep coming back after every torpedo was a fleet of machines that never fired a shot and looked from a distance like nothing at all. Start with the lie, because the lie explains everything that follows. In the second week of October 1944, before the landings in the Philippines, Admiral William Halsey threw 4 carrier groups against the Japanese airfields on Formosa. The island was a fortress of land-based aircraft, and the Navy wanted it broken before the invasion of Leyte. The defenders sent up everything they had. Most of their pilots were half-trained, rushed through a syllabus gutted by a fuel shortage and 2 years of losses, and they were torn apart in the air. Over 3 days, Japan lost something north of 300 aircraft. But at dusk in bad light, a handful of torpedo planes slipped under the fighter screen and reached the ships. On the evening of the 13th, they put a torpedo into the heavy cruiser Canberra and flooded both her engine rooms. The next night, they hit the light cruiser Houston. The pilots who got back to Formosa came home with stories. They had flown through fire in the dark and watched columns of water climb the sides of American hulls, and in the confusion of a night attack, a green aviator will believe almost anything he sees. They reported carriers ablaze and capital ships going under. The claims climbed the chain of command, getting rounder at every level, until Imperial General Headquarters announced that the American Third Fleet had been broken. 11 carriers, 2 battleships, a string of cruisers, sunk or wrecked. The cabinet carried the news to the emperor. Newspapers ran the triumph across their front pages. Even senior officers who should have known better, up to Admiral Toyota of the Combined Fleet, decided some kind of great victory had been won, and Toyota ordered an all-out pursuit of what he took to be a fleeing, beaten enemy. Tokyo had sunk the fleet on the radio. The fleet had not been informed. Halsey understood what was happening, and he had a sense of humor about it. The message he sent back toward Pearl Harbor reported that the Third Fleet's sunk and damaged ships had been salvaged and were now, in his words, retiring at high speed toward the enemy. There was nothing on the seabed off Formosa. There were 2 crippled cruisers, badly hurt and very much afloat, and the long problem of what to do with them. That problem is where the real story lives. Look at what happened to the Houston, because it is a useful measure of the thing that saved her. The torpedo had caught her on the bottom of the hull, amidships, while she heeled into a high-speed turn. It tore a hole about 30 feet long and flooded all 4 of her engineering spaces at once. Power gone. Steering gone. The ship took a list to starboard and began to settle, and her captain, William Barons, looking at a hull with no power and the sea coming in, signaled that he believed she was lost and asked that her crew be taken off. Then the damage control parties got ahead of the flooding and the abandonment stopped. Hundreds of men were moved to nearby destroyers to lighten her and to get them clear of a ship that might still roll over. A skeleton crew rowed her to fight for her. The accounts disagree on how many. The ship's own war damage report describes around 200 men remaining after the transfers, while some later tellings put the number who stayed behind closer to 450. What is not in dispute is that the men aboard had volunteered to ride a flooded cruiser through waters still inside Japanese striking range, with no way to move her under her own power. She could not move at all. The heavy cruiser Boston took her in tow, then a fleet tug took over, and the 2 cripples began their crawl west. 43 hours after the first hit, a second torpedo found the Houston, blew open her stern, wrecked her aircraft hangar, and started a gasoline fire. She now held more than 6,000 tons of seawater inside a hull built to weigh under 12. In one photograph taken under tow, she sits so low that her main deck is almost awash, more submarine than warship, riding at something close to 21,000 tons of dead weight and water. By every reasonable expectation, she should have been a war grave. The Americans had a different idea about her and about the Canberra, and the idea shows how the war in the Pacific was being run. Rather than scuttle the cripples, Halsey kept them, and his staff talked him into using them. The two wrecks and their escorts were christened Cripple Division 1, and word of their slow, vulnerable retreat was broadcast on open channels in the hope the enemy would take the bait and send a surface fleet out to finish them. Toyota, already sure he had won, very nearly did. The bait never quite closed the trap, but the intent is the point. The Navy held two of the most badly mauled ships afloat, and instead of writing them off, it dangled them as live bait and expected to tow them home afterward. Home, in this case, was 1,300 miles away. For 13 days, the tugs dragged the Houston west, her crew shoring bulkheads and pumping and fighting the list the whole way until she reached the anchorage at Ulithi. Now, hold that picture and ask the obvious question. A light cruiser with 6,000 tons of ocean inside her is sitting at an atoll in the middle of nowhere, more than 3,000 miles from the nearest American Navy yard. There is no port, there are no docks of stone, no cranes bolted to a pier, no graving basin cut into the land. There is a coral reef, some palm trees, and a lagoon. What was supposed to happen next? What happened next is the secret weapon, and the men who built it would have laughed at that name for how plain the thing actually was. The idea went back 20 years to a clause in the Washington Naval Treaty that forbade the United States from fortifying its bases in the Western Pacific. Unable to build permanent yards out toward Japan, Navy planners worked the problem sideways. A dry dock could not be built on land the treaty kept unfortified, so the answer was a dry dock that floated and could be towed to the war. The concept sat half-funded through the lean peacetime years, and then once the shooting started, became one of the highest construction priorities the Navy had. A floating dry dock is a simple thing made enormous. It is a U-shaped steel box with hollow walls and a hollow bottom. Flood the tanks and the whole structure sinks until its floor is well under the surface, deep enough for a ship to be floated in over the top. Then, the pumps run, the water is forced out, the box rises, and it lifts the ship out of the sea on its own deck, high and dry, propellers and rudder and torpedo holes all hanging in the open air where men can get at them. The genius was in how the Navy got these things across an ocean. The largest were built in pieces, each one a self-contained steel hull about 93 feet long and 3,800 tons. Each box was given just enough of a rough hull form to be towed through heavy seas at 6 to 8 knots, its tall side walls folded down flat to cut the wind and lower the center of gravity. A tug took one unit, or a string of them, and dragged it thousands of miles across the Pacific. At the far end, riggers welded the boxes together end to end, and a row of separate steel hulls became a single continuous dock more than 800 feet long. Joined up, the biggest could raise 90,000 tons. That is a loaded battleship lifted clear out of the water by a structure carried to the spot in numbered crates. 58 of these sections were built during the war. They had their own diesel generators, their own ballast pumps and machine shops, their own crews living aboard, and a pair of cranes that ran on rails laid along the top of the walls. They were, in the most literal sense, shipyards mailed to the front and assembled on arrival. The first was put together at Noumea in 1943. Others followed at Espiritu Santo, at Manus in the Admiralties, at Guam, and forward to Ulithi as the war rolled west. And around the docks grew the rest of it, the part that turned an empty lagoon into the busiest port on Earth. The whole apparatus had a name as dull as the work, Service Squadron 10. Nimitz called it his secret weapon, and he was not being poetic. Within a month of the Navy moving into Ulithi, 6,000 ship fitters, welders, carpenters, and electricians were living afloat in the lagoon aboard repair ships and tenders. One of them, the Ajax, carried an air-conditioned optical shop, and a metal shop that could melt down base stock and pour almost any alloy or spare part a damaged ship needed. Another vessel, the Abaton, was rigged to look like an ordinary tanker, but spent the war distilling fresh water and baking bread and pies. There was a barge whose entire job was making ice cream, 500 gallons a shift. Sit with that for a second. The United States towed a 90,000-ton crane 4,000 miles across a contested ocean and parked an ice cream barge next to it. By March of 1945, there were 647 ships swinging at anchor inside the reef, and on the busiest days, more than 700, which made a coral atoll most Americans had never heard of and could not have found, the largest and most active naval base in the world. Its existence was a secret. By the time the censors released the name Ulithi, the war had moved on and left the place a quiet lagoon again. What all of it was for was repair, and the numbers from the repair logs read like science fiction. In a single month, early in 1945, the floating docks and shops at the forward bases put 52 ships back into service. They rebuilt 60 feet of a fleet carrier's flight deck on the Randolph in 18 days. They welded new bows onto cruisers whose own bows had been blown off. The amount of work, one officer noted, would have made a peacetime Navy yard throw up its hands. There is no monument to a man who spent his war welding a new bow onto another man's cruiser. This is the engine the Japanese could never see and never matched. They could fight a ship, hit it, watch it burn and settle, log it as sunk, and 3 weeks later that same hull would be back on the gun line off the next island, its torpedo wound cut out and replaced. A nation that has to send a damaged battleship home to Japan and wait months for a yard slip is fighting a different war than a nation that carries the yard with it. The Pacific is enormous, and Japan had counted on that size to wear the Americans down, to make the distances themselves a weapon. Service Squadron 10 quietly canceled the distance. The ocean stopped being a moat and became a workshop, which brings the wrecks of Cripple Division 1 back into the picture. There was no dock at Ulithi, yet large enough to take the Houston when she limped in at the end of October, so the repair ship Hector and the cruiser's exhausted crew did what emergency work they could to keep her alive and stiffen her flooded hull, and then she was towed on, another long haul, to the bigger base at Manus in the Admiralty Islands. At Manus, on the 8th of January 1945, the Houston was floated over the deck of one of the great sectional docks, ABSD-2, and lifted out of the sea. She was not alone on that deck. Beside her sat the light cruiser Reno, torpedoed by a submarine off the Philippines weeks earlier, and very nearly lost herself. Two ships the enemy had every reason to count as kills, sitting side by side in the open air on a dock that had been towed to that lagoon in numbered boxes and assembled on the water. The sea ran off their hulls. Men walked underneath them with cutting torches and looked up at the holes. If there is a single image for how the United States won the naval war in the Pacific, it is that one. Not a battleship's guns. Two written-off cruisers raised out of the ocean and put back together by a ship that had no business existing in the middle of the sea. If this is the kind of history that's worth your time, the best way to keep it coming is to subscribe. These videos take real research to put together, and that is what this channel is for. The Houston herself does not get the clean ending. The wound was deep enough that the work at the forward bases could only make her seaworthy, not whole. She was patched and stiffened and sent all the way home to a stateside yard, and she never rejoined the Pacific fighting. But she floated home on her own bottom instead of resting on the seabed off Formosa, and that was the whole point of the system. Other ships had it better. The carrier Randolph took a kamikaze, lost a stretch of flight deck, and was back in the war in under 3 weeks. Battleships hit off Okinawa were lifted, patched, and returned to the bombardment line. 52 ships in 28 days. Then they went back to the war. The strangest tribute to the floating docks came from the enemy, and it came late. By the spring of 1945, the sectional docks at Seadler Harbor had been doing their quiet work for the better part of a year. On the 22nd of April, a Japanese plane came over high, and the pilot looked down into the harbor and reported 2 American aircraft carriers riding at anchor below him. There were no carriers there. What he had seen and what his command wrote down as a pair of flat tops were two empty floating dry docks, ABSD-2 and ABSD-4, their long flat decks bright in the water. 5 days later, a torpedo bomber came back to finish the job and drove a fish into one of the pontoon hulls. The enemy could not even name the machine that was beating him. He had been losing the war to a thing he mistook from the air for the very kind of ship it spent its days resurrecting. And the dock the bomber hit was ABSD-2, the same one that 15 weeks earlier had lifted the Houston and the Reno out of the ocean and held them in the sun while their wounds were cut away. It took the hit in Section G, was pumped out and patched by the men who lived aboard it, and went back to work. The machine that raised the dead ships could, it turned out, raise itself.